All right, so today I'm here with Noah Smith. He's one of the premier econ bloggers, and what makes his writing so great is he weaves economics in with a deep understanding of technology, politics, culture, and a whole lot more. I highly recommend subscribing to his Substack at Noahpinion. That's just noahpinion.blog. So Noah, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So I want to ask first about the story of your intellectual development. You're a self-described left-leaning techno-optimist who supports an agenda of material abundance. Who's most influenced you to get here?
Well, I'd say that Brad DeLong, one of my podcast co-hosts, certainly influenced me a lot. Reading his blog since I was a kid, sort of a kid. Yeah, he's been very influential. Obviously, in terms of the writing world, I think that Tyler Cowen, Matt Iglesias, Paul Krugman, those were sort of all people that I looked up to back in the day who made me want to become kind of a blogger. Obviously, in the econ world, there's economists who kind of helped give me my worldview, like my advisor, Miles Kimball, and, a bunch of others. Was that who you're thinking of, or were you thinking of more historical figures like Dostoevsky or something?
Yeah, I think what I'm wondering is specifically on how you came to your views, right? Because economics is a profession where some people have different schools of thought. Yours particularly is a flavor of let's go build a bunch of stuff, but also let's give everyone healthcare and make sure that people are generally taken care of. I'm wondering, is there a specific strain of thought or people? Did you get all of that from Brad DeLong, or are there others?
No. I mean, I made it up. It's like that meme, source. I made it up. I think most people do this. Very few people just get their ideas in a package from someone else or somewhere else. And if you do, you're probably doing it wrong. Think for yourself. That think for yourself doesn't mean come up with everything completely originally, but it does mean that sort of evaluate and be willing to select from different ideas or schools of thought or sources or ideologies. I think ideology is the most common package deal that people accept. And you're like, okay, well, now I'm deciding to call myself a socialist. So I'll believe this thing, this thing, this thing. And there's sort of a list of things that you then have to believe. It's like you buy this subscription package, right, to the socialist ideology. And then if you once you say that my ideas about the world are determined by this group that I'm part of, then any little sort of thing that contradicts you, or that where you deviate from the canon, I guess, exposes you to the possibility of being kicked out of the group. Excommunication. Whereas if you just sort of accept all the things, you can kind of defend or wave away or not even think about the weak ones that much. And then the ones you think are stronger, you can go to bat hard for. And then you just take your ideas in a package deal. The thing is, and this can be for many people like an intellectual muscle suit, right? It's like once you have this body of socialist scholarship or of conservative scholarship or whatever to draw on, then you sort of have an answer for everything kind of out of the box. And it can make you feel very smart. And then you can talk to people who spend all day studying this and saying, well, no, you're wrong because of, and then you just pull out this stock thing, right? It makes you dumber. It makes you much dumber to live life like this. It makes you make a lot of mistakes and misunderstandings because you won't understand the stock arguments are applying, even if they would be right in some context, you won't understand the right context and you'll sort of misapply them or not know what they say. And so then also, of course, where the ideology is wrong, you go wrong. And so there's lots of stuff like that, basically. And so I think I never really accepted a package deal. I sort of picked and chose from wherever. If you're asking specifically, why would I combine sort of a growth-oriented techno-optimism with kind of, redistributionist ideas, that's pretty simple. That's not uncommon. That's the New Deal. Right, that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. If you ask me, where did you get your ideas? The answer is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I don't want to put anyone in internment camps, whatever, right? And lots of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's ideas were dumb and failed. For example, the idea in the early New Deal to allow companies to create cartels to pump up their profits, hoping that higher profits would make them feel more comfortable about hiring workers, that was disastrous. And it just failed and collapsed. Or the idea to do something similar in agriculture where you went out and just, shot a bunch of cows so the price of beef would go up so that farmers would, get more profit so they would, be okay. It was terrible. It was a bad idea. But then some ideas were great. Financial regulation, getting off the gold standard, sort of unemployment insurance, social security, and, infrastructure improvements, public works, all these kinds of things. a lot of these things were great ideas and they persisted. They stayed afterwards. So that kind of idea package, the New Dealers were very much pro-progress, very much pro-growth. They were trying to electrify the whole American South. They were trying to build roads and railroads across the entire nation. The physical built environment that we now know in America, including our highways, and our freight rail system, which is still the best in the world, and our electrical grid and all these things, these all come out of the New Deal, right? These are all very growth oriented. And are also like, our science policy, a National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, all these things came out of the New Deal, came out of those people. But they were also redistributionists because they had this idea that we've got to all go together, right? We can't have growth that leaves people behind. I think the growth of the late 1800s, like, the 1890s and 1910s and 20s had been very unbalanced. It was very unequal, right? You saw a few people getting a lot of money and then a lot of people only getting a little bit more money. And I think people were, although there was growth as a whole, I think people were very mad about inequality. And this eventually led to political instability. You saw riots in most American cities. You saw people joining extremist factions like the KKK or, some leftist movements. And then you saw political turmoil when the Great Depression hit and sort of, people's stock portfolios weren't going up anymore. And you couldn't sort of paper this over. You saw the danger of demagogues like Huey Long, and you saw the danger of even was a coup plot against FDR. People had planned to coup him. But that was, they didn't go through it, that they chickened out. Anyway, so then this, you saw a lot of political stuff, right? You saw people marching on Washington for their pensions, saying, where's my pension? You saw the army coming out and just writing them down, right? Just writing them down right in Washington, D.C. And Douglas MacArthur was called in to do that. You saw a lot of this political turmoil, and you saw in other countries actual communist revolutions and threats of communist revolutions, and you saw right-wing backlashes, and you saw fascist takeovers of countries, and basically you saw extremism around much of the world centered partly around ethnic stuff, but partly around economic stuff, and I think those two are always harder to separate than people think. But you saw a lot of countries sort of fall to these crazy regimes that we now call totalitarian, right? The fascists and the communists. And Roosevelt looked at this and he's like, no, we don't want that here. Any sign of that happening here is bad. And so they decided we're going to do redistribution to give everyone a stake in the system, everyone a piece of the action, even as we pursue growth. Sort of growth will grow the pie, and then redistribution will make sure people get more of a fair share of it. And that was later came to be known as the mixed economy. And that has robustly proven to be the best way to organize any nation in the world, to the degree that essentially every country now does some form of that. China abandoned central planning and, didn't abandon central planning, but largely, and privatized a lot of stuff. And then it grew very fast. They still kept a bunch of kind of crappy, inefficient redistribution mechanisms in the Chinese economy. But whose system I think is kind of bad, they went for the mixed economy. And Sweden has very pro-business policies, even as it has this incredible welfare state. Right? Japan has this corporate welfare state. And basically Singapore, like the government will basically like give you a house. Everybody gets a house, and the government looks after your financial security your whole life, basically, in Singapore. And so you've got redistribution of one sort or another pretty much everywhere. And you've got growth-oriented policy pretty much everywhere. And then, the flavors differ. But the basic idea of combining those two things, that's not a weird thing to believe in. That's normal. That's what everybody does. And my specific ideas about how you might want to do growth and how you might want to accomplish that and what kind of redistribution you might want to do evolves over time, right? I haven't always thought the same things. But, the basic idea of combining those things is just so normie that everyone should basically think that. The only people who are out there thinking, get government completely out of the way of private enterprises, just let the private sector do everything, or like we should have central planning and the government should do everything. Like, the only people doing that are doing it for rhetorical reasons, right? In practice, they would never do anything like that. Even Javier Milei, he's not going to do anything like of the sort. He's all his super libertarian stuff. And I like Javier Milei. I'm a fan of his. But a lot of his libertarian stuff is theatrics. Obviously, he's going to take them in a more libertarian direction than they had been, which is not libertarian at all. Like he's saying we need to go more in this direction, but he's not going to make them, sort of the like, anarcho-capitalist paradise that he kind of pretends in a lot of his speeches. He's going to do something mixed. So how about that?
That's great. That's a good overall background. Actually, what is your overall view on Javier Milei? You just said you're a fan.
I am a fan.
You are a fan. Do you think that more countries need leaders like espousing those types of ideas, or is he too far in one direction?
Well, it depends, because like I said, I think a lot of his stuff is rhetorical, and he's going to push in that direction, but not get like super far in that direction. I don't think he's going to I don't think he's going to make Argentina an anarcho-capitalist state. The presidency in Argentina is very powerful. You're almost an elected dictator, honestly. But then I don't think he's going to push very far. Even without as many checks and balances as we have here, I think he's not going to push nearly as far as he says. But he's going to push somewhat. And whether or not a country needs a Milei depends on where they are right now, right? So maybe I think for the United States that a Milei type guy would not be very useful, because most of our problems where we need less government are in terms of regulation and not in terms of welfare. Mm-hmm. Whereas, there's some countries that are extremely overregulated. So, for example, like Germany and France, I think could use a Milei type of guy right now. Although they're also facing the threat of war and an energy transition with Russian gas cutoffs and things like that. So they're facing different problems. Argentina is kind of at the edge of the world doing its own thing, and so it's not always a great proxy for other people. It's kind of one of a kind. But I think that maybe some Europeans could listen to Milei.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about macro. So you wrote a post where you kind of reviewed Milton Friedman's ideas, and overall you gave him a C+, which like for macro, you said, hey, that's pretty good. Like macro's pretty hard. No one really knows what's going on. My question is though, like which macroeconomist would you give the highest grade of all time?
That's really good. Oh, well, the thing is the fact that I can even give Milton Friedman an overall grade speaks to his incredible influence and prolificness, right? He redefined how we think about economics. I would give Paul Samuelson a higher grade. Yeah, but even him, I would give him like maybe the top grade of anybody, and I would give him a B-. This is like he got so many things. He got a lot of things wrong, but he's similarly prolific. Robert Solow maybe a C. But then so there's a couple of guys that I think got it better. Greg Mankiw's done pretty well, but he's obsessed with tax. He's become obsessed with taxes, but in terms of his macro stuff, he was quite he pushed the profession really in a needed direction. Bob Hall, Michael Woodford, sort of these guys push the profession in an important, needed direction. Right now, you have their work being carried on. Or Mark Gertler, is another guy that I think is really important. Of course, these people are less important to the field than Milton Friedman, because Milton Friedman did so many things, and he did a lot of things first, right? He came to a lot of things first.
Yeah.
So then he's more important. I could compare him to guys like Solow and Samuelson, but Mark Gertler is, I think he's a lot narrower in his focus, and I think he's done well because he's been very narrow. If you try to reinvent all of macroeconomics, you're going to get a lot of things wrong. And Milton Friedman did, but and sometimes he switched what he thought over time. So then, like, which one do I grade? Right? Do I grade him on the first one or the second one? In that post, I actually did both. I was like, which is, I don't know, but sometimes people change their opinions. Like John Maynard Keynes certainly changed his opinions a lot, and he famously said, "When the facts change, I change my view. What do you do?"
Yeah. Well, what would you say today? So you talk a lot about how like over the last few years, people came up with wilder and wilder sort of like heterodox ideas, but at the end of the day, kind of like quote mainstream macro seems to still be holding up pretty well. Like now in 2024, where we've had sort of the last couple of years, we got to actually learn a lot and like test a couple of theories. Like how would you define mainstream macro today?
Mainstream macro today? Well, I'd say that the basic new Keynesian idea is still in place, which is the idea that if there's inflation, you can stop it by raising interest rates, and that a lot of times this will cause a recession, although not necessarily. So we didn't this time, but if there's a recession, you can cut interest rates and stimulate the economy and sort of stabilize the economy that way. And you can also use fiscal policy to do the same thing. And then for a long time, people said, well, fiscal policy is kind of crappy alternative. You just use the Fed. But then we realized that when interest rates go to zero, the job becomes a lot harder. You can still do stuff, but it may distort the economy more. Like you can have the Fed go lend to every business in America, but that may not be a great idea. It may be a better idea to have the federal government build infrastructure. So we also know that there's things we want the federal government to do, or when I say we know, I think most economists think, such as build a bunch of roads, or infrastructure like that. So the question is, do you want to do this counter-cyclically? And I think that the answer to that has been yes. There's an economist named Bob Hall who writes very intelligently and legibly about this. If you want to read Bob Hall, you can understand the idea of thinking behind fiscal stimulus. And so basically, the benefit of stimulating the economy out of a recession with fiscal policy is that you can do the stuff you wanted to do anyway and just do it now. So like you can take all the road repairs you wanted to make and all the science funding that you want to do and blah, blah, and you can do it you can say, well, now's the best time, especially because interest rates are low. So the federal government can lock in low interest rates for borrowing for a long time. And ideally pay it back later, although we in practice haven't done this recently. We used to do that. But then, but I guess the idea is this can stabilize macroeconomic fluctuations, the inflation and the recessions. And I think that basic idea is still there. There's been evolution, though not revolution, in recent years. People have decided, okay, well, so the biggest danger for recessions is financial collapses, financial crises, and the finance system is inherently fragile, and sometimes it collapses, and then you get this big recession. Obviously, the Great Recession did that, right? That was the Great Recession. But so. I mean, in the past, the Fed hiking interest rates was what caused a recession, or something like that, or even something else like an oil price spike can cause a recession. And so you can have these multiple causes of recessions, but I think that the importance of finance, macroeconomists have really upweighted the importance of finance, and I think that this current episode is causing macroeconomists. There has been a debate on whether or not forward-looking expectations matter for macro and how much they matter. So in other words, do people see the Fed getting tough and do they say, okay, I'm just going to give up inflation. I'm not going to raise my prices because the Fed's getting tough. Or do they actually require you to go through the whole rigmarole, economy damaging rigmarole of Fed raises interest rates, companies can't borrow, companies lay people off, people can't consume, prices go down. That's what happened in the early 80s, right? That's why we got the Rust Belt. That's why we got this economic devastation of the early 80s. But we did destroy inflation that way, but it was costly. Now it looks like we've brought down inflation costlessly, at least so far, knock on wood, like I hope so. We brought down interest rates. We brought down inflation, without triggering a recession yet. Actually, I'm writing a post right now about whether or not we're about to trigger a recession. That's where macro is kind of right now. But I think that what a lot of macroeconomists are now doing is the longer term, harder project of instead of just tweaking our models to like fit whatever the news was last year, right? I think what they're now doing more is going and looking for the sort of underlying forces, the behavior of consumers and the behavior of companies that make investment decisions and things like that, and trying to understand those better so that we have a more micro-founded or more well-grounded understanding of how booms and recessions happen. So maybe we don't just have to sort of like tweak our interest rate policy, and we can do better than that.
Yeah, I'm curious about this point. Like, how much innovation do you think is left in macro? So like on the one hand, you've talked about how macro is like really still in its infancy, and like all of our models have a ton of guesswork and there's a lot of holes that you can poke in them. But like on the other hand, do we really have that many more discoveries left that are on the same level as, well, raising interest rates is a good way to fight inflation? Like that seems like a pretty huge revolution. Do you think we'll have any more discoveries that are of a similar impact?
Policy-wise, I'm not sure, but in terms of our understanding, I'm pretty sure we will. And the reason is data. The reason is scientific advances tend to come from advances in the availability of data. Even when you get theoretical advances, they're usually to explain some anomaly that you couldn't have found with earlier apparatus, such as the Michelson-Morley experiment leading to special relativity, if you know that example. We see some new stuff, we're like, oh, how do we explain it? Then we create a theoretical framework to explain it. But we need to see the new stuff first. So in terms of seeing new stuff, in the past, all you could do was wait for more recessions to happen, and then over the many decades and centuries, you could accumulate macro knowledge that way. Now we have like every price of everything that is ever sold is tracked electronically, and who it is sold to, and what those person's finances are, and what else they bought, and what their employment situation is, and how they did at their job. And so we have so much data, and what a lot of people are working on now is how to anonymize that so we can study all that without being intrusive into people's private lives and doing universal surveillance. But if we can just do universal service, and so China doesn't care. But China also doesn't care about macroeconomics because until recently they decided they had conquered the business cycle and they had invented an all new, awesome, sort of quasi-communist way to erase business cycles from the world. And it turned out they did not. And they will spend the next 10 years understanding what that means. But then in the meantime, here we are without our little magical communist bullshit. And so we can talk about that more later. But then here we are. And so we've got to figure out better policies. So what if instead of interest rates, right, what if we could do like targeted lending to certain kinds of businesses? And just for a tenth the price, we could stimulate the economy for a tenth the price, right? And not just introduce big distortions and change asset prices. What if we had very fine control? That's where I think the policy could be done. I think looking at sectors to stimulate, looking at ways to manipulate consumer expectations to avoid like an expectation spiral where everyone just gets really pessimistic and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Mind control. Looking at, so targeted policies like that. Or, accelerated depreciation of some kind of fancy form of accelerated depreciation in recessions so that companies keep investing, something like that. Financial policy, how to better financial regulation, better financial intervention when there's a crisis, things like that. I think we're having financial crises that teach us each time like how to preserve the stability of the financial system without compromising growth. Maybe we're learning, but I think that the more we understand about the granular way that the finance system works, the better data we get, the more we have the chance to learn. So I think that I'm very optimistic about the massive data flood that we've gotten in recent years, leading to better targeted policies that don't rely on these very blunt instruments that we've been using.
Yeah. What about, maybe you've written about this, but I was looking for it for a bit. I couldn't find it. Do you have a view on sort of this like market monetarist idea of NGDP targeting?
I think, NGDP targeting is an interesting idea. It's in certain models, it works very well. But then the implementation of NGDP is very difficult. So, actually the question is less what do you target, it's what do you do, right? Also, there's the fact that NGDP is real growth plus inflation. So NGDP targeting, if you have an NGDP target of 4%, right? And your theory says that this is because a healthy economy tends to have 2% growth and 2% inflation. Or say it's 5%. So you make 3% growth, 2% inflation. I think that's what a healthy economy looks like. Suppose you get that wrong. Suppose that, for some reason, growth is just slow now. Suppose productivity growth is low, or suppose for some reason growth is just high now, right? Then you're going to make a mistake because you're going to just cause too much inflation or even deflation. You're going to cause too much inflation to hit your NGDP target. To know the target, you've got to know what the normal situation, you've got to be able to set the target, and that target may not be constant. That target will depend on things like productivity growth and, like the natural rate of interest or things like that. It'll depend on these underlying things that may not be stable. So, Scott Sumner would just say, oh, look at the past. In general, in the past, we used to have about this level of NGDP, so let's just target that. But that may not prevail in the future. There's no underlying fundamental reason to expect the future to be like the past. Maybe growth will be faster due to AI. Maybe growth will be slower due to lower population growth. Things like that. And so at that point, your NGDP target needs to change. It can't just come from some blogger sort of eyeballing the past.
I see. So it's the real growth component that if it changes over time, you think it throws it out of whack.
It is, but it's also, I would say also there's anchoring of inflation expectations. So, in the 1960s, we had fast growth. We had 4% inflation or something like that. And that's typical for an economy in a catch-up growth phase. But in the 1990s, that lowered. We had still pretty good growth, but we had, more like 2% inflation. And so the thing is, if the Fed can set expectations very well, we may be able to get away with a lower rate of inflation in the long term. So in other words, and that would require lowering the NGDP target because you lower the inflation component of the NGDP target. And so in other words, you become more ambitious. You say, look, we can get good growth with less inflation than we could before. So in that sense, you'd have to alter that as well.
So question on this sort of old Keynes idea about the 15-hour work week. He's famously said that we're going to get so much technological advancement and efficiency in the economy that everyone will just be able to work 15 hours a week. like sitting here in 2024, do you feel like that's going to be true, and why or why not?
Well, that's a really good question. What we have seen is a decline in work hours over time. People used to work all the time. Like when they weren't working at their job, they were doing the kind of stuff we don't count in GDP, but which is real work, such as housework and childcare. A lot of it was uncompensated work. And so people were just working all the time. People worked like dogs back in the day. Even in like the 1950s, you imagine this like housewife with nothing to do, in this nice floral dress, just like running around, whatever, blah, blah, blah. I have actually seen that there was a bit of that in Japan, but really in the old days before, modern appliances, like the housewives had to wash dishes and like wash clothing and fold clothing all day. I guess people still have to fold clothing, but you'd have women stay home and do this housework, and then childcare was just so onerous. And then like the housework was just such a pain. It was so much because you didn't have a dishwasher, you didn't have a clothes washer, you didn't have a dryer, you didn't have this and that, right? You had to cook, right? You didn't have like toasters and microwaves and like, timers on your oven, right? You just had to like cook a full meal for everybody, and that would take like all day to prepare this food. It was just so hard. There's no DoorDash. Anyway, like, so at that time, people were working like crazy back in the day. And what we see is that people still work quite a bit, but they work a lot less than they used to. We have a lot more leisure than we used to. So in that sense, Keynes' prediction is directionally correct. We haven't reached a 15-hour work week, and I don't know if we ever will, but we do work less than we used to. And a lot of that goes unmeasured, but a lot of it is measured. If you look at work hours over time, it's just like down, down, down. And so, and that's true in every rich country. Now, on the other hand, we haven't decreased our work as fast as Keynes thought. And the reason for that is we must value work more relative to leisure than Keynes thought. There's a few reasons. One reason is that when you find out that people actually want to work. If you can't actually go much below a 15-hour work week because people do not want to work less than 15 hours. In fact, a lot of people want to work 20 to 30 hours a week, and they just want to. And that's a thing Keynes didn't really think about. Work makes people feel valuable and like they have something to do, I suppose. Another reason, though, and perhaps a more important reason, is what we call consumption leisure complementarities. Economic growth doesn't just create, new ways to produce stuff, right? It creates new things to be produced. Now we've got video games, and now we've got, like tourism to Japan, and now we've got this and that, subscriptions to Noah Smith's Substack. And so we've got all these awesome things you can do with your consumption that, people really value. And how do you get that? By working more hours, right? You got to work more hours to afford the Noah Smith Substack subscription. And so, but really though, this is what economists think is the main reason we still work as much as we do, is because there's more reason to work. And there's a dark side of this too, which is to say that people work to keep up with the Joneses, right? People have, it's not just what people want for themselves, it's what people want relative to what their neighbor has, right? You're not a hermit. You see your neighbor with a big house, you're like, well, if I don't have a big house, I look like a loser, even if I have all this fun free time. I'm a bum. I'm a loser. If you see your neighbor sending their kid to some fancy private school, or I need to send my kid to that private school too, or else I'm the poor person of the neighborhood. I'm the loser of the neighborhood, right? So I better work to be able to do that. And so those are called positional goods, because it's about your position relative to someone else. So people work for that. Part of that is conspicuous consumption. You want people to see that you did something. Part of it is just so that you know that you're not a loser. But this is probably a big factor in what's keeping people working so hard.
Yeah, I always find it like kind of interesting because we have so much more left. You just think about, I use this example all the time, but like Microsoft Excel, right? Like you would think that back in the like 80s or 90s, you now have a spreadsheet. These accountants or people who dealt with like actuarial tables or something. Couldn't they just like work 1 hour a week and get the same amount of stuff done? But like they don't. They just like now there's just way more of that stuff being done. So I always wonder, like, is there any end to that, or is there some natural floor? It sounds like you give a couple of reasons why there might be a natural floor.
There's also yeah, like technology obviously matters. Like some technology, like we can imagine technology that would do like every single thing that we want the technology to do for us, and we just like sit on our back and sort of order out, and then we will to some degree redefine ordering out as work, right? No one thinks right now, if you're like before, if you prepared food for yourself, we wouldn't count that in GDP, but at least someone would think of it as work, right? Well, me clicking DoorDash is work. It's just a lot higher leverage work to get this thing. And of course, someone somewhere is working to prepare that food. But me telling, GPT to like arrange my life for me counts as work.
Yeah. So how much should we worry about inequality, like even if everyone is getting richer? So say we can make a trade, and over the next, call it 5 years, we can take the median real wages and push them way up, and they'll grow faster than they ever have in history. But we also get way more billionaires, and the Gini coefficient goes way up as well. Would you make that trade?
Yeah, of course. Definitely. I think there is some level of inequality, and I don't think it's mostly about billionaires, but I think it's, and I'll explain why, but I think there is some level of inequality that will cause social unrest and political collapse, and then you get lower median income from collapse. So I think that, to keep society stable, you've probably got to hold inequality below some level. But also I think that that's a very simple, easy thing to say, and it's a lot more complicated to do in practice. One reason is because I think that a lot of the inequalities people care about are actually status inequalities, which are harder to redistribute. Tyler Cowen might agree with me about this. So then, it's not necessarily about how much money you make. It's about like who gets to be the boss of the knitting club. There was this famous blow up in the 2010s of the Knitters of America, and like how they all like backstabbed each other and canceled each other. Yeah, like who gets to be in charge of that? Like, or who gets to boss who around at work? There's a lot of status stuff, or who gets to dunk on who on social media. And so like status is important in society, and it's not just money that provides status, right? It's like, yeah, if you're a billionaire, you're going to get some status. But even then, like, if you're like the richest man in the world, like he doesn't exactly have any friends, right? Or he doesn't even know if he has friends. How would you know? And so like, so status is different for different people, and it's complicated. And so redistribution of status is actually a lot harder than redistribution of money. And also billionaires, I think, don't actually matter that much for popular rage at inequality. The reason is because people don't see anything that billionaires do. You can walk in and say, I have $1 billion. Look at my bank account. I have $1 billion. No one knows what that means. Like, no one can think of $1 billion, right? People trying to imagine the lifestyle of a billionaire will probably, a normal person trying to imagine the lifestyle of a billionaire will probably end up imagining the lifestyle of someone with about $50 million, right? You cannot imagine the lifestyle of a billionaire. I sometimes hang out with billionaires, right? I can't even imagine what they're doing when they're not hanging out with me. It's something, right? Sometimes they're just making themselves coffee with the same coffee maker that I would use. And then sometimes they're like, going and hanging out with like important political people and determining like giving advice that will determine like the course of the world. And then like sometimes they're like, I don't know. Apparently, so then we found out that there was this guy Jeffrey Epstein who was the pimp for all the super rich people, which Stanley Kubrick tried to warn us about, but we didn't believe him. And so anyway, we found out that. And so maybe they're doing that. Maybe they're having like weird ass sex parties, or maybe they're on their mega yachts like Larry Ellison, or maybe they're like smuggling, trying to get involved in like secret arms smuggling things to Russia, or, who knows what the hell these people are doing? I don't know. I hang out with a few of these people. I don't even know. And they're all very different, because once you get the ability to do literally anything you want, you're going to just do some crazy crap. What would I do if I were a billionaire? I would do the exact same thing I'm doing now, which is to say, gripe on the internet about things and pet my rabbit. I would just do it for free. I would be blogging for free, as I did for 10 years before I blogged for money. And so that would be my hobby, and I would just rant and rave about stuff. And then I would, and then I would pet my rabbit. And then, of course, I would just give away all the billions of dollars to like shelter rabbits,
What about Thomas Piketty's idea that inequality will continue to get worse indefinitely if R is greater than G? Is this true?
No. There's reasons why that is not true. Yeah, first of all, G is not a perfect proxy. I could go into the math of this, but basically there's reasons why this doesn't work. First of all, if R is greater than G, there will be forces that make R less than G after a while. And Keynes pointed this out. But also G and R are not perfect proxies for it. It's a slogan, right? It's not perfect proxies for, who's making money, right? Because different people experience different rates of return. And, you also have income inequality, which matters a lot, which is not in, R versus G is just about savings. It's just imagining a world where everybody just makes their money from like the interest on their savings. There's random shocks, which can, as you know, the geometric mean of something will be less than the arithmetic mean. If my stock grows by, suppose that your wealth tomorrow were to grow by 100% and then fall by 100%, how many dollars would you have?
0.
You would have 0. So or suppose it grew by like 200% and then fell by 100%. The arithmetic average rate of growth would be 100%. The geometric mean would, right? The geometric mean would be negative 100% because you went to 0 over that time. And that's another reason why the math of this doesn't quite work out. It's just a good slogan. In terms of empirical data, the truth is that right around the time Piketty published his book, inequality, wealth inequality, and wage inequality stopped rising and started falling. They didn't fall. They haven't fallen super quick.
If there are just like mathematical problems with a formula like that, like how is it that it becomes so popular? Like his book, you don't hear from him much anymore, but when that book was popular, it was like really popular in the mainstream. Why is it that econ has this sort of phenomenon where like ideas, MMT is another one where they can be really popular for a few years and people who are in the profession can discredit it with just kind of like basic math?
That's just because they are proxies for subtler, less extreme things that are pretty right. So Piketty's ideas got popular because after the Great Recession, a bunch of people were pissed that like they lost all their housing wealth while rich people's stock wealth was fine. And that pissed people off. Because if you looked at the wealth curves for middle class people and even working class people and then rich people, the percentage returns over time were about the same. But then they became very much not the same in the Great Recession because housing died and stocks soared. And so you suddenly had this giant divergence you'd never have before. Now, this is what I mean when I say R is different for different people. Middle class people's wealth depends on owner-occupied housing in the United States, overwhelmingly. Rich people's wealth depends overwhelmingly on stock markets. So when stocks did fine and housing crashed, middle class people took a bath and rich people were fine. And that made a lot of people mad because their nest egg, just evaporated, and yet someone else's nest egg is doing great, right? And so that made people mad. And so I think that was really what made people mad about, and so of course, most of the people getting mad and thinking about this were not working class. They were not working as a cashier or like, a flight attendant or whatever. They were working as some sort of professional who reads the news, right? And reads the news, earns a decent salary, gets mad, and just lost all their money in their house. And so I think that a lot of those people got, they were looking for some reason to get mad about inequality, and it didn't matter if it wasn't exactly the kind of inequality that they had experienced, right? It doesn't matter if the theory, if there were this grand, centuries-long theory of the inevitable progress of the economy was actually right or not, right? Like, they were just like, I'm mad about inequality. Here is a book that says inequality is bad and keeps going up, and it makes me mad, and so I'll buy it. And no one read that book. I didn't read that book. I read the papers that the book was based on. I didn't read the book itself because one thing you learn in econ is you just read the papers.
It's a big book, yeah.
It's a big book. It has a few things the papers don't have in it, but it is pretty much just the papers. Because the one thing about economists is that they always want to publish papers so that anything worth publishing in a paper will be published. Anything published in a book that was not published in a paper was by definition not worth publishing. By inference, not worth publishing. So read the papers if the papers exist. Anyway, so no, I didn't read that book. That's not always 100% true. So Robert Gordon's book does have, the difference is history. That's the one thing that they'll have that they can't publish in papers is history. Economists are not always good at history, but sometimes that's very useful. So for example, The Rise and Fall of American Growth is a book that's actually worth reading as a book, instead of just like the 1 or 2 papers that he wrote about that subject. Or the Brad DeLong's book, Slouching Toward Utopia, is worth reading because it's just history, right? That's historians write things in books. But if you're writing stuff about like, economic data, it's going to be in a paper. If you're writing stuff about theory, it's going to be in a paper.
Yeah. So you have a post called "All Futurism is Afrofuturism," and it cites a paper. This, like, I'd heard this before, but this post really introduced me to the idea, and I can't stop thinking about it. It forecasts basically that sub-Saharan Africa will have a population of 3.4 billion people by the end of the century, which...
Well, that's all of Africa. 300 of that will be sub-Saharan, but yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke then. So 3.4 billion in all of Africa. Got it.
In all of Africa, according to this paper. And that's actually revised way downward from where it had been.
But that's it, like, brings in this huge question, right? Like, a huge portion of human welfare then is going to be based on, like, how well does African development go? So, like, if you were put in charge to advise the African governments on making sure this goes well, what would be your advice to them?
Well, so number one piece of advice is focus on health and education. That's just something, and currency stability. Currency crashes are what destroy resource-dependent poor countries. That is what leads to food shortages, fuel shortages, angry people in the street overthrowing your government, years of IMF restructuring and blah, blah, blah. This is a currency crash. All politically unstable countries have the political incentive to pump up the value of their currency so that you can maintain power in the short term, because people then get to consume more cheap imports, usually of food and fuel. That largely pacifies people. And so then people get largely pacified, and so they don't revolt. So if you have short-term instability, you can mollify people with an expensive currency by pegging your currency too high. The problem is eventually the crash happens, the bill comes due, and you get instability. And you get into these cycles of instability, which are chronicled in the book This Time is Different. Ironically, people use that book to describe it, to try to apply it to a developing country crisis, which is typically much different than that. But more to the point, for African countries, keep your currency low, because then it's never going to crash. Avoid currency crash like the plague. Spend your money on education and health. Improve education, improve health, because that is what will give you the raw material needed for an industrialization boom or any sort of development, is education and health. And so health includes reducing child mortality. There have been huge strides in reducing child mortality in Africa. That needs to continue. Communicable disease, obviously, just malaria, and a lot of other sort of, a lot of Africa's hot. It's sort of near to the equator, so it's hot. A lot of it's very wet. This creates disease. Hot and wet. Hot plus wet equals disease. And so Africa really has to spend a lot of money to eradicate disease. Now, if you look at Europe actually used to have a lot more disease than it does now, including some tropical diseases were actually prevalent in Europe, but they spent a lot of money getting rid of them. Africa is going to have to spend a lot of money getting rid of a lot of these tropical diseases, and just basic health, especially for moms and little babies. So those are the health priorities. There's some other like stuff you can do, like nutrition, like make sure nutrition's okay. Put iodine in your salt. I don't know. But health is big, and education is of course important. You can't really develop unless everyone can read. So you got to just, universal literacy is like day one, right? People have got to be able to add and subtract, multiply and divide, so that they can keep a book, right? Everyone needs to have basic numeracy.
Yep.
And so then if you've got those, like, reading, writing, and arithmetic, as we used to say, there was a reason we used that phrase, which is that's what you need to work in a factory, right? You need to be able to say 12 units plus 17 units, and so, like, you need to be able to, or like, $420 a month times, 7 months, right? You need to be able to do that. Maybe you can do it with a calculator, but you need to know what that means. And so anyway, basic literacy and numeracy, give that to everybody. And then you can get a labor-intensive manufacturing boom. Some people claim that the boom won't be as big now because things are more automated now. Maybe, but it's working for Bangladesh right now. It's working for Vietnam. It will raise you out of a destitute level of poverty. Bangladesh makes shirts. They have a bunch of people making shirts and pants, and they're growing like crazy. And so do that. And then even if jobs largely switch to other stuff like online services, which some people believe, like Danny Roderick and Joe Stiglitz believe that's the thing of the future, maybe you're still going to need to know how to read, write, and do some basic math. So teach that. basically a junior high education should be all you need to be a factory worker. A high school education is all you need to work at a standard desk job. Anyway.
Yeah. Okay, so question here on some of your old blog posts. So here's one you posted from 2013 where you said, you asked the question, when have econ blogs changed your mind about something? And you cited a few examples here. So one was Tyler Cowen convincing you of the Great Stagnation, Ramez Nam convinced you about solar, which actually pretty prescient. And then there were a few others. My question to you is like, what have you changed your mind about recently if you were to write that post today?
So great question. What have I changed my mind on? I've learned about the increased importance of, I've increased my assessment of the importance of bureaucracies. Good bureaucracies. It wasn't just blogs that changed my mind about that. A lot of people wrote about it. It was also just observing sort of results from things, but those results were communicated to me through blogs. So I now think that we, before I was heavily influenced by my time in Japan, where I saw sort of a too overly powerful, ossified bureaucracy make big mistakes. But now I think that we've erred too far on the other side, and our bureaucracy just can't do anything, and so we need to beef it up, especially housing and transit, we can't do because we keep just outsourcing it to people whose only goal is to rip the government off, and then they rip the government off. And then you're like, look how inefficient government is. Well, no, if you just had the fucking engineers in house and had the right, can I curse on this podcast?
Yeah, go for it. You can say whatever you want.
When you have the people in house who know how to build a train, right, in the state government, then they don't get bilked by all these mafia, or the nonprofit mafia in terms of providing social services. San Francisco is out of money because it spends so much money on its nonprofit mafia instead of just doing stuff, providing services to its people directly. It outsources it to these people whose only goal is to bilk the government for yet more money for themselves. And so the incentive problem from doing things from subcontracting, from the government subcontracting, is really bad. Of course, the libertarians are just like, cut it all, don't do any of it. Well, then you get a third world country. So we're going to do it. We're going to build roads, right? We're going to build trains. We're going to build houses. We're going to do these things. We're not going to be a third world country. And so we're going to need to have the government have competence. And so increasing my assessment of the importance of bureaucracy has been one thing. I am now more worried about the deficit than I've ever been, national debt than I've ever been in my life. Partly that was because, partly that's because the situation changed, right? We borrowed much more than we had before, and interest rates have gone up more than they have before, right? And we increased spending on some things, which we hadn't done before. Before, our increased spending was just a function of healthcare getting more expensive over time. But now we have. And also our demographic situation is looking less favorable than it was before. Our fertility rate, which had been pretty robust, has dropped. And so all of those changed facts are reasons why I should worry about the deficit more. But those were brought to my attention by blogs and shown to me by blogs. How about those two things? I'm more worried about the debt, and I'm more worried about lack of state capacity.
Great. That's a great takeaway. Wanted to congratulate you on this award you recently got. Tyler Cowen said that you get the Writing Every Day Award. That's a pretty big one.
The oh my God, doesn't this guy ever shut up award.
Yeah. So it is impressive, though.
They blog more than I do. They just write shorter posts.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to say. Your posts are they're meaty a lot. Like, you cite a lot of papers. You reference a lot of historical facts that they're not just something you just thought of in the morning. So first off, that's really impressive. But I feel like you might have been asked before, what your production function is, your output. I wanted to ask more about what are the advantages of publishing frequently? Do you feel like you do a better job just writing every day and getting something out than you would if you sat and posted something every month or wrote a book?
It's different. It's very different. I believe in a squiggle curve for depth. So if you go incredibly deep, you can be the one person who writes the book about construction costs, and then that'll influence the world for generations to come, right? If you write a quick thing about here's some things you can read about construction costs, you can very quickly meme that into the public consciousness. But there's a valley there. And the valley is if you go deeper, but you don't go deep enough to become the super expert, I think that there's a suboptimal, sort of local minimum in there where you're basically overwhelming. You're doing some stuff that's too complicated for people to assimilate quickly, but doesn't really change the game in terms of understanding. And I want to avoid that. And sometimes I worry that my posts are too long, that I'm actually going down that slope. And in fact, I should make them shorter. Bloomberg had good evidence that people don't read past 800 words.
Interesting.
I think that may be because of a biased sample. What I hope is that, so the real reason to write every day is because people skip half of what you write. And if you don't write every day, they'll still skip half of what you write. So writing, and you'll notice that I write the same post over and over sometimes with slight changes, updates. You know, like, I'm not talking about when I repost things. I'm talking about when I just I've written I wrote 6 or 7 posts about inflation, and that was a problem. That's not a lot. I mean, someone writing for Bloomberg will be so repetitious, they'll write 20, 30 posts about that same topic. And then until it gets just really irritating. But you write things over and over because you never know how they'll hit, right? I wrote, for Bloomberg, I actually wrote a piece about wow, China's really big. You don't even understand how big China is. It's big, man. And I wrote that post and no one read it. And I was like, well, of course, China's big. But then later, just for fun, I decided to write a variant of the same post, and it became my most read post. Whoa, China's big, dude. Whoa, just change it. It's the day you publish it on and the hook that you use. And you don't know what's going to work. No writers ever know what's going to work ahead of time.
That's interesting. Okay.
I have posts that take off and just blow up. And I had no idea that was going to blow up. And then I write a, post. I'm like, wow, this is I just spent, the other day I took multiple days to research this steel industry, to understand the steel industry. And I read a whole bunch of papers, blah, blah. And I tried to do one of these deep dives like Brian, because I wanted to write like Brian Potter, right? I wanted to write like he does. And I was like, okay, I want to write that about the steel industry. In fact, I did this with a couple different things. I did this with mortality rates. I really just read a ton. I've done this 2 or 3 times. I'm experimenting with a, sort of a more in-depth, sort of research-intensive type of post. I think of them as Brian Potter posts because he does this 1 a week. And I just took some extra days and did it. I skipped a couple days of writing, and some people unsubscribed from my blog, and then they were low volume. But then some people unsubscribe, and I wrote some posts about the steel industry. I thought a lot of people were going to like that. No one read that. Except for my hardcore readers who read everything I write, but it was a low engagement post.
Is your goal engagement, or what is your ambition for the blog? Do you care more about maybe reaching a certain type of audience, having a certain influence, just getting the most readers?
Well, I don't know. I don't really know how to filter for that. I know specific people. I can check to see, if my friend read my post, right? Because I know my friend's email, right? And then I can check that. What I can't check is a general class of people. So I can't check did the tech people on the West Coast read this one? I don't know. How do I know? The analytics aren't that good. Eventually, someday Substack will get AI predictive analytics to guesstimate from people's emails. Who's part of, and then use LLMs as an interface. So I'm okay, I want to know how many techies on the West Coast read this post, and then LLM will be able to do this. That's 2 or 3 years out.
Yeah.
In terms of when that's coming. But then LLMs will transform analytics as they will transform many things, because they'll be able to ask wide-ranging questions that the thing isn't necessarily set up to give you, and then it can sort of cobble together an answer that's sometimes wrong, but often right enough that it gives you a good idea.
Yeah. So I've seen very little anime. I think pretty recently I watched Perfect Blue and Ghost in the Shell. I liked them both. I thought they were pretty good.
Did you just say the word anime?
Anime. Oops. Wait.
I love you. No, I love it. Animu is, you say animu. Part of being an anime fan is that you make fun of the pronunciation of anime.
Well, so here's the question then. So you've got someone calling it anime like me, who doesn't know anything about it.
Anime. I love it. I'm going to call it that. Yeah. Use animu.
Animu next time.
Animu.
So what's your pitch for why I should watch more of it?
Smart people who have been largely insulated from your cultural milieu except through the attenuated medium of packaged media like science fiction or, TV shows. So imagine if you had some very smart people who lived on a planet far away from Earth, and all they could consume was like, books and TV shows that America produced or the Earth produced, right? And then that's all they consumed, and that became their understanding. And then they wanted to make media based on this, and this inspired a bunch of stuff that they did. But because they didn't have constant interplay and back and forth with people on Earth, they didn't know exactly, like, they didn't constantly calibrate their output to like what the market wants this week. They just read Anna Karenina and Neuromancer, and they were just like, I'm gonna, what if I mash those up, man? And they've got like a totally different starting point, and milieu of like what stories are told, how you tell a story, what social things you want to talk about, blah, 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 what kind of characters, what kind of motivations for the characters, all this stuff. They just have a totally different starting point. And then but they're just as smart as you. They're just as smart as any of the people around you making stuff for you specifically, but they made it for themselves. And then you get to watch that. You get to see, it gives you diversification, right? Intellectual diversification. It lets you see what people create in an entirely different cultural milieu.
That's an awesome answer. Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was looking for. You made it sound super good. Okay, so let's say you were to run for president and your whole platform was to steal like the good things about Japan and bring them to the US. What would your top policies be? Like, how restricted
Urbanism.
Basically is, what was that?
Urbanism.
Urbanism? Okay, so urbanism is like the
high
that's the number one
inheritance
thing.
tax. High inheritance tax, that's a good one.
Okay, inheritance tax and urbanism.
Japan is all about equality of opportunity. They don't, it's not just a buzzword in Japan. It's like, oh, your parents have like $5 million and you thought you'd start out with a nice $5 million, amount. How about $500,000? That sounds more appropriate to go. And then, so you really have to live your own life. Your parents can't do that much for you in Japan. Everyone is sort of their own person. Because you can't have these little mini dynasties like, my dad owned a car dealership, so I grew up rich. And the natural inequalities of the intergenerational inequalities of having parents with money is smoothed out. You can still have a little bit of this, but then there's this general understanding that everybody's got to stand on their own 2 feet and make their own way in the world. There's pragmatic problems with the implementation, such as like, are you going to make people sell their whole house? Like just to pay the inheritance tax? Like then you can't inherit a house. So they should make probably some exceptions if you like want to keep living in your parents' house, blah, 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 blah. But the point is that, but then the problem is if you do that, everyone just like hangs on to their houses and becomes NIMBYs and it's hard to redevelop things. Anyway, so there are some problems with it. There's some challenges to implementation, but the high inheritance tax for people with what we would think of as relatively modest fortunes, right? Someone with $5 million, we're not going to tax your inheritance. Like you just get that, right? We're not going to put an extra tax on it at the end of your life or at the beginning of your inheritance. They don't tax the dead person, they tax the inheritor. It's obviously the same thing, but then you can't, it's harder to say, oh, it's a death tax. No, it's a tax, it's an income tax. It's just an income tax, that's it.
Yeah, this is the second part of my question though, is like how much do you think we're restricted by culture to making this happen? Like, is the reason that Japan can implement these policies like deeply cultural, and you think there'd be a lot of resistance to it in the U.S.? Do you think that's it, or are there other reasons why it'd be challenging?
It's cultural. I just think that's it. I mean, some of that's just a hysteresis, right? It's just like we're not used to it. We are used to having this wealth baked into our families, and that makes us not want to give it up.
Yeah.
We have in another sense, we have so many self-made rich people, so to speak, but we have so many self-made rich people that when you look out at the richest people in the world, it's mostly not like the Waltons or some famous family. It's, people who built their own businesses. That's who most of the richest people in the country are. And so that obscures the fact that when you look more at the low level of like, who's the richest person in this town, that's more likely to be someone who inherited their wealth. So over time, over time, we will build up more and more. And the other thing about inherited wealth is you tend to lose it. The families tend to lose it. So we don't have inheritance tax, but we have inheritance. One good reason to do inheritance tax, by the way, is it prevents the rich bum phenomenon. So a lot of people coast on family wealth and don't really add their productivity to society. So one thing about forcing people to be self-made is that suppose you have a great business person who produces all this, value through creating a business, right? And then they have kids. Those kids are going to be smart. They're going to inherit some intelligence. They're going to have good parental influences. They're going to, learn business skills. They're going to get networks and connections that could let them start businesses easily. They will be well positioned to be incredibly economically successful people. But if they inherit all this wealth for free, they will not have the incentive to become successful on their own. They will not have the incentive to be self-made. And therefore, we have the rich bums in America. And you see these rich bums, like trust fund people whose parents have, I don't know, like not that much money, like $10 million, whatever, going to 15 million, I don't know, maybe less, going to live in Brooklyn and just be hipsters and write for some socialist like Jacobin or some shit, or have a lefty podcast. And all these and they went to college. They're not dumb. They went to college to like hook up, but they went to college. They went to like liberal arts college, or they went to like state university or whatever. And then they with their parents' trust fund, they go move out to Brooklyn to party. They do a bunch of coke, and they their parents pay their rent, and they think they're employed, and they think they're self-sufficient because they pay their non-rent things, which often just involves like buying some food and their friends giving them free coke. And like, I'm being unfair here. Some people do buy their own cocaine, but anyway, but these people all, these people, if you hang out in New York, you just meet a ton of them. The Trustafarians, they're called. And there's a lot of these people, they're fucking useless. But oh my God, they're useless. And a lot of the people screaming for socialism in this country are not the downtrodden working class. They're the rich bums in Brooklyn who, on some level feel that they've been denied the status that their parents had, even though they have their parents' money, because they haven't done any accomplishments. And so nobody respects them for their accomplishments that don't exist. And so instead, what they do is they try to backdoor themselves into it by, glomming onto some lefty bullshit. Like, unfortunately, not the good kind of lefty stuff, which is like, raise taxes, because guess who gets their taxes raised? It's you. Or YIMBYism, build more housing, or, public housing, industrial policy, all the like the good lefty stuff that I like. Obviously not the bad lefty stuff I don't like. So no, but they, of course they're going to glom onto we need political revolution in this country, and just obsess over student loan cancellation, or I don't know, whatever the cause of the week is, or just rage at the Democrats, right? Because the Democrats are the only ones who are going to pay attention. If you rage with Republicans are like, I'm going to step on you. And then, but like, there are Democrats who are like, oh no, leftist youth, oh, you're the working class, you unemployed Trustafarian in Brooklyn. You're the true working class. We're going to like cancel your loans for you and blah, blah, blah. And then cancel the salt, or give you salt deduction for your taxes. Anyway, the point is that a lot of these useless bums should have their inheritances taxed away. And Japan would do this. Japan would absolutely do this to them. And then they would be like, oh, fuck, I have to use my talents and opportunities and education and skills and networks and blah, blah, blah. Like, I've got to use that to make money for myself. Oh, shit. Oh, fuck. I guess I better do that. And then then they go do that. Right? They know from day one they're going to have to do that. It's not sudden. It's not like the sudden thing of like, oh God, I expected to be a Trustafarian and now I can't. Now I've got to work like a regular schmuck, right? They don't think that. They think, I accept that I live in a society where work is important. And even if my parents were successful, I've got to succeed on my own. So I would like America to be a society where people have to succeed on their own, where we have equality of opportunity. We're never going to have perfect equality of opportunity, right? There's so many things that give some kids more opportunity than others, and we're never going to erase that. But the opportunity of just sitting on your ass and being a bum from just, inheriting like $5 million or something like that, that's ridiculous. I just don't I don't understand why America, that was supposed to be the land of self-made fortunes, right, and of equality of opportunity, where the talented and hardworking succeed, have extra success. I don't know why we're having all this gentry sitting around being rich. And again, this is not the billionaires. The billionaires almost all made their own money, right? Billionaire type fortunes don't last many generations. where are the Rockefellers now? But at the like $5 or $10 million level, lasting one generation, we have all these bums, and tax that. Anyway, how's that?
Yeah, no, that's deep, deep cultural analysis. That was good. That was really good.
Can I tell you about Japanese zoning policy real quick?
Yeah, please, let's go.
Yeah. All right. So in America, what we do is we say this area may be used for this purpose. This area may be used for that purpose. We specify the purpose that an area can be used for, right? Japan specifies the things it can't be. So instead of a list of allowed things, it gives you a list of prohibited things. In fact, they do it even more simply than that. They just assign something a nuisance number and cap the number that you're allowed to build in this. They assign every possible economic thing like a nuisance number. And they give you then a cap on the nuisance a neighborhood can afford, right? So like a sleepy single-family home residential neighborhood will have a low nuisance cap, right? And so the nuisance could come from pollution, it could come from noise, it could come from crowded density. These are all nuisances, and basically you just pile on the nuisances, and it's sort of arbitrary bureaucratic allocation of the weights of like how much you value noise versus pollution versus density. But as for that, so they basically say like, here's what you're not allowed to do. Like you can't build over nuisance 7. Go build anything else you want. And then, you just do it, right? You don't have to go through all these massive approvals and blah, 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 NEPA and shit like that. Anyway, we need this type of zoning in America.
Got it. So inheritance tax, zoning, that's the platform.
Yeah. And okay. Lots of other little things, but let's go on.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask about when you think technology can be dangerous. So as a techno optimist and someone who's generally like very positive on technology, you do have this one post where you talk about teen depression and starting around 2012, 2013, and you cite some evidence where it's like it's not totally conclusive that the phones are causing teens to be sad, but there's quite a bit of evidence that says there's a really good shot. And I'm curious what you think about, like, at what point should we be worried about it? So I think your conclusion, and you could correct me here if I'm wrong, I think your conclusion was basically like, hey, this could be really bad right now, but over time, humanity will figure out sort of like how to deal with it, whether it's, with cigarettes, for example, like it came out, it was super addictive, and then people sort of figured out they should not be smoking cigarettes. But for a technology where someone opts in to use it, so say
and that we should ban it in public places.
Yeah, and you can ban it in public places, and there's other things. Like, what evidence would you need to see to start to really worry about something like phones? So, maybe the VR headset for Apple comes out, and you have
fentanyl is a technology. Fentanyl is a chemical technology.
And so, yeah. What's the right way to think about this? Not fentanyl, made by Apple.com or something. When does it cross that threshold?
Oh, so the most important reason, people talk about behavioral stuff, is it safe to use this? So you try fentanyl one time to see if you like it, then you decide, oh, I don't like that, but now I'm addicted, or something like that, right? If people can't control addiction, and you can't know going in whether you control addiction or what that's like, and you're just ignorant. So there's behavioral reasons to sort of ban things those get talked about a lot, like paternalism. Can we trust people with their own consumption, right? Can we trust people to know when it's okay to do a drug and when it's not? Those debates are sort of eternal and ongoing. But I'd say that the more well-accepted reason to think that a technology is dangerous is called an externality. It's something where the people who buy the thing and the people who sell the thing are insulated from at least part of the harm the thing causes. So, for example, if there's a factory that pollutes and just dumps poison in a river, and then gives everybody in the local town cancer, and I buy something from that factory, neither me nor the factory has to deal with the cancer that those people get from that pollution runoff. And that's why we have laws against pollution, right? It's very difficult. People spent a lot of intellectual effort in the mid-20th century trying to come up with alternative ways to deal with that problem of externalities, such as you assign property rights to you give the people the right to know what pollution they're getting, and sell their health for a certain amount of money, and all these things, right? That's the Coase theorem. But then none of them work. You just have the government discourage something, right? You tax pollution. That's what works. in practice. There are some specialized cases where some of the other things. So, for example, acid rain pollution credits worked really well, right? So you can sometimes deal with it via these mechanisms, but they're not sort of a universal panacea. It worked in my simple ass theory paper, therefore do it, right? And even with the pollution credits, it was something the government came in and did. It wasn't like a self-organized like cartel of everybody acting as an independent firm that just contracted to do this. And God. Anyway, more to the point, if there are externalities from phone use that are bad, we need to think about that. And the type of externality people are zeroing in on is the social externality of consumption. Is the fact that even if I would hate to use phones, I would love everyone to just interact in person. But I have to interact on the phone because everyone else is on the phone.
Yeah.
And what if 80% of kids are thinking that? What if 80% of kids hate phones, but they can't go do in-person interaction instead because there's a coordination problem, right? Everyone else is on their phones. And so the fact that everyone else is on their phone, it's just an equilibrium that locks people in, right? And so honestly, when I look at Gen Z people, are you Gen Z actually? You look young, but...
No, millennial, squarely millennial.
Okay, millennial. Okay. But then when you have, like Gen Z people I see trying to run away from the phones. When on the rare occasions when I meet Zoomers and we exchange information, they want to exchange phone numbers. They don't want to exchange like Instagram or whatever. They don't want to exchange Facebook or Twitter DMs or whatever the hell they want, or Messenger or WhatsApp and Signal. Those just work via phone, but then they just want to text on a phone like we would in 2006. That's what they want to go back to 2006 and text on a phone. They want to share stuff ephemerally with a highly curated group of people they don't just want to post their whole lives like they're a micro celebrity. I think people are starting to learn how to deal with this. Younger generations are, and millennials, especially younger millennials, may end up being a lost generation, and it may be the alphas that deal with this the best. So it may just be learning, right? It may be like we lost generations to drunkenness and tobacco, like all my grandparents, and that whole generation died of lung cancer, but I won't.
Yeah,
probably, right? I have a much lower chance, and kids being born today will have even much lower chance than me of getting lung cancer from cigarette smoke, because when I grew up, there still were some people who smoked. I got a little bit of secondhand smoke, and so we get better over time, but we lose whole generations, right? So maybe our generation is the lost generation, lost to a technology in some sense. Of course, we're not completely lost because we all still have houses and whatever, and rabbits, and we'll be fine. But maybe we took a big hit from this thing we didn't know how to deal with, right?
Yeah.
Because it took society as a whole, in terms of the externalities of nobody wants to connect on fucking Instagram. Everyone wants to connect on the phone number, right? Everyone just wants to text directly and keep in touch that way. If that's what we're really moving toward, and that's what anecdotally, that's what I see. And, there's some data to support this. People, young people are moving toward push media like TikTok. Young people are watching more videos, consuming more content, and posting less and commenting less on things. I think that's the way to do it. I don't know if that's fast enough. I don't know if it'll be complete enough, and I don't know if the government could do something to encourage this. But I think that I don't necessarily always have to have a hook for government policy at the end of my posts. I don't always have to say, government, come in and save us. Like from pollution, yeah, we need the government for that. For cigarette smoke, we banned it in local, some public places or whatever. So the government saved us a little bit. And then but for this, I don't even know if we need the government to save us. I think there's downsides to TV, right? It could be isolating, socially isolating. That's a network effect. Fewer people to hang out with because they're watching TV means that hurts me too. The world's full of little externalities like that you can rattle off the top of your head. The question is whether they're big enough to do anything about. And I think over time, people learned that if you sit around watching TV all day, you don't have friends. And don't let the TV be your friends. And you could see people writing this from the very beginning, Fahrenheit 451, a lot of the dystopias that people are using TV as their fake friends.
Yeah,
you ever had to read that book in school, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury?
Yep.
Anyway, it's about the dystopia of television. And then Frank Zappa, would sing, he sang the song Slime from the Video about television rotting your brain. And that's why my parents went overboard. They were overzealous. They restricted my TV input, so I just could watch Star Trek. That was the only TV I was allowed to watch.
That's a very Noah Smith upbringing. Yeah.
It really is. And so then later I discovered TV. So I like actually in the, and then I went to college and moved to Japan and all that stuff. I didn't even have a TV. And so like I discovered TV a little bit in like 2010 when I was in grad school. And then I discovered TV more in like 2016 when I got a TV. And I was like, wow, TV's great. So for like, I would say 4 years, 2016 through 2019, for all like essentially most of the Trump years, I watched a lot of TV. And I loved it. It was great because by then TV had gotten so good. We had, Game of Thrones, we had Atlanta, we had Stranger Things, all these like amazing high production value TV series from the streaming boom, right? Which splashed all this money onto TV. So I discovered TV at exactly the right point. I'm glad that I didn't spend my youth watching Everybody Loves Raymond or like, How I Met Your Mother or some shit. Like, or Friends, Jesus Christ. Later, my parents did allow me to watch Seinfeld. I think they wanted me to connect with Jewish culture because I didn't have any Jewish culture growing up. And so, I had to learn it all from Seinfeld.
Yeah. Okay.
And so then that anyway, sociologists call this symbolic ethnicity, where you try to connect with your ancestral roots that you got severed from. Anyway, right. Like, a third generation Korean American, like wanting to like wear a hanbok to be like all traditional and cool. Anyways, or like Italian immigrants, like fourth generation Italian Americans having like pasta night to connect with their roots. But like, yeah. So for me, that was Seinfeld, to connect with the ancient Jewish culture of like annoying New York professionals. So TV, we learned how to deal with it. I hope. I think we learned a healthier way. We've seen TV use drop. I think that we just don't see anyone worrying about addiction to television anymore, unless it's TikTok, maybe. But no one even worries about YouTube. Like consuming push media videos become just a natural part of our life. And so I think we can learn how to deal with these things. Books, or newspapers, right? Like in the early days of newspapers, all it was like pure lies that said like, go to Paris, go to the, like palace and just kill whoever you can. Kill those fuckers, kill. And you'd print these on like broadsheets and you'd hand them out, right? That was a newspaper.
Yeah.
Or like, slavery is great. Here's how to own some slaves. Or like, you just have the craziest shit in newspapers. And, it was just like there was no quality control. And I think over time we evolved quality control. And so now you can complain about the New York Times all day. And I think I don't subscribe to it. I'm not a giant fan of it. But like compare it to the broadsheets of like the French Revolutionary period, or even the American Revolutionary period, or any of these times, or even the yellow press of William Randolph Hearst, i.e. Citizen Kane, of the early 1900s. And you just see like, it's no comparison. It's so much better now. The evolution of journalistic standards. Government had a little bit to do with that at some point, but mostly it was just a industry consolidation thing. And like, eventually consumer pressure did it. So we as a collective learned how to deal with that with print media technology. And so those are some examples. And I think we will learn how to deal with cell phone technology.
That's an optimistic point to end on. So Noah, thank you so much for being generous with your time. It was great talking with you today.
Absolutely. It's fun. Anytime.